Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Perfect. All right. First, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. And then we're going to get started right now. So I think the doors might be closing soon. And then, yeah, we'll get started.
So my name is Chantel Spicer, and I'm the chair of the Vancouver Island University Students Union.
And my name's Avery. I'm the Director of External Relations for the Vancouver Island University Students Union.
So we're going to be hosting this evening, but before we do get started, I would like to acknowledge with humble gratitude that we are on the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation. As we go about our work with equity and solidarity at the heart of our work, we hope that territory acknowledgements such as this will help our society move towards real reconciliation for Indigenous communities across Canada.
Great. A few logistical items. So just wanted to remind everyone that there's no food or drink allowed in the theater. If you have accidentally brought some food in from the lobby, please make sure that you take your garbage or any crumbs or anything like that with you. That would be really appreciated. Thank you. As well as I will give you the structure of the evening and how the evening is going to go. So we're going to start with Seth Klein on proportional representation, followed by a Q&A session. After that, we'll have a short 15-minute break where you can go back to the lobby and get whatever's left on in terms of food or water. And we're going to have, after that, we'll start a panel discussion on Nanaimo housing solutions for the remainder of the evening.
So tonight, as you can tell, we present you with an opportunity to consider two very important and closely related issues. Firstly, how our democracy does and could work for us regarding the upcoming proportional representation referendum in BC. And secondly, a discussion on one of the most important issues facing all levels of government at this time, which is access to affordable housing.
In under a month, British Columbians will be participating in a referendum on proportional representation. From October 22nd to November 30th, residents of BC will vote by mail-in ballot. This is an opportunity for us as voters to have our say in the most foundational part of the democratic process. It will be the third time that BC has put forward a referendum for proportional representation, with the last one occurring in 2009. Since then, much has changed in the realm of politics. Our understanding of proper representation, diversity, and the necessity of a more just society. Our first speaker this evening is Seth Klein. Seth is the British Columbia Director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, a public policy research institute committed to social, economic, and environmental justice. He has been a social activist for over 30 years. Seth was hired to open the CCPA's BC office in 1996. Under his direction, the CCPA BC office has grown to 14 employees, 6,000 supporters, and publishes regular research reports on topics such as poverty and equality, taxes, climate, justice, and healthcare. Seth served for 8 years as co-chair of the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition and is on the advisory committee of the Metro Vancouver Living Wage for Families campaign. He is an advisory board member for the Columbia Institute Center for Civic Governance and a co-founder and instructor for Next Up, a leadership training program for young people committed to social and environmental justice. His research deals primarily with welfare policy, poverty, inequality, and economic security. Another note and interesting item about Seth is that Seth has been listed by Vancouver Magazine as one of the 50 most powerful people in the city, as well as by Homemakers Magazine, this one I thought was quite funny, among the 60 men that we love. He does not know how he ended up on this list, but he told us that he humbly accepts the latter. All right, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Seth Klein.
Good evening, everyone. So we're going to switch over to the slides. Thanks for coming out on a Tuesday night. This is a bit of a blast from the past for me. Believe it or not, the first time I spoke on this stage, I was 19 years old. And I just turned 50 this year. And I have been passionate about proportional representation since I was in high school. I was a little odd as a high school student, and I still am passionate about it. For just so I know, how many of you are CCPA supporters in the room? Okay, oh, that's pretty good. So for those of you who've heard me talk before and give CCPA talks, you've probably heard me say, when I say in a sentence what it is the CCPA does, I say we produce and promote research that aims to show people that our best values are possible. And I use this line all the time, but the truth is, I actually think this issue, this referendum, and electoral reform and proportional representation represent a huge opportunity in that regard. A chance to fundamentally strengthen our democracy, to improve policymaking, but more than that, just to blow open the space of what's possible and the ideas that are in play. And my one-line description of it is that it's about liberating us to vote our values. That's what this referendum is about. And so as Avery said, we're looking at a mail ballot between the 22nd of October and the end of November. I feel it to be an historic opportunity and one that we can't let slip away again. So here's what I'm wanting to do in the time that we have, and we're going to have time for Q&A as well. First of all, I want to walk you through what's wrong with our current system, our current first-past-the-post system. Secondly, how would proportional representation, or pro-rep, as we say in short, how would it fix that? Then I'll walk you through what's on the ballot, and in particular, I'll walk you through the 3 options for reform that's on the ballot, and then to close with a little discussion about how we can actually win this thing. That's the plan. Sound good? All right. So first of all, what is wrong with our current first-past-the-post voting system? Exhibit A. I'm sorry. I know people see enough of this. But here's the thing. Often when I'm now having a number of debates about this topic, and on the no side, they frequently say, it's unusual and proportional representation will enable the far right. Well, actually, first-past-the-post systems like we have are the exception, not the norm. There's very few major democracies left that still just use first-past-the-post. There's the US, there's the UK, there's India and Pakistan and a few other smaller former British colonies, and there's us. And look at the record. This guy lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton, but won the presidency, and these alt-right elements live in his White House. Look at the most recent Indian election, which elected Modi and the BJP with 31% of the vote. This is a far-right Hindu nationalist party that won with 31% of the vote. And then, as I say, there's us, so Exhibit B, the most recent Canadian example until last night, the election of Doug Ford, with 40% of the vote, won 61% of the seats, and 100% of the political power. And as we saw a couple weeks ago, the one check on political power is supposed to be the courts, and yet he was prepared to invoke the notwithstanding clause even to override that. So the problem here is one that we call the problem of false majorities. It is endemic with first-past-the-post, governments that win 100% of the political power with less than 50% of the popular vote. So this is how that breaks down in Ontario. In June, the popular vote was 40% for Doug Ford and the Progressive Conservatives, about a third NDP, almost 20% Liberal, almost 5% Green. That was the popular vote. But this is how it turned out in the seat count, 61% majority for the Conservatives. The NDP got about their proportional vote that time, but the Liberals and the Greens considerably less. This is the last result federally when Trudeau was elected in 2015. And with that, won 55% of the seats and 100% of the political power. And that means for 4 years, he gets to decide with impunity which promises he will keep and which promises he will break. But I want to come back to the Ontario results for a second, because when I was listening to the punditry on the radio after the Ontario election results, I kept hearing, oh, Ontarians voted for tax cuts. Well, hang on a second. No, they didn't. A majority of Ontarians actually voted for the exact opposite, parties that were proposing the exact opposite. Which brings me to another problem. It's not just false majorities. First Past the Post produces a false narrative about who we are and our values and what's important to us. You see that played out in the political map of British Columbia, right? So the last BC results, you had the NDP winning most of the seats on the coast and in the Lower Mainland, and the Liberals winning almost all the seats in the interior. And so it tells a false story about rural British Columbia, that it's very conservative and individualistic. Again, not true. Half of those people didn't vote for that, but it creates this false story about who we are. Now, I want to quickly walk you through a little election history in BC, because first of all, the false majority problem cuts both ways politically. So you may remember, some of you, that in 1996, the NDP actually lost the popular vote to the BC Liberals, but the BC Liberal vote was not as what we call efficiently distributed, and so the NDP won a false majority. 2001 is an interesting one, for those of you who remember that one. 2001 is when Gordon Campbell was first elected, and it was actually the only time in half a century that a governing party won an outright majority of the popular vote. Gordon Campbell won 57% of the vote. But remember what happened. With 50% of the vote, 57% of the vote, it was a wipeout. They won every seat except 2 in East Vancouver. And the NDP lost official party status. This is not healthy in a democracy. Her Majesty's loyal opposition is supposed to be able to do its job to hold the government to account. And I want to pause for another moment on this year, on that election result. Because, again, as I debate people on the no side, I keep hearing this argument, proportional representation will erode local representation. We all want an MLA who's local, who represents us, who's accountable to us. And we do. I'll come back to that. But here's the thing. Again, some of you will remember that after winning that election, between 2002 and 2005, the Campbell government then instituted a massive program of austerity and cutbacks, school closures around the province, and cuts to welfare and children and families and environment. Now, I spent a lot of time traveling around the province in those years, giving talks, and there was this growing grassroots opposition to the cutbacks. And over again, I kept hearing the same story. My MLA has locked their office, and they will not take a meeting with their local constituents. It didn't matter if you had an MLA with an office down the street. Effectively, you had no local representation, which is why when we think about meaningful local representation, geographic proximity matters, sure, but so does political affinity. That matters too. We want a system that accomplishes both. 2005, 2009, 2013, we get the return to false majorities for the BC Liberals. Over and over again, the system distorts our choices. But another problem with First Past the Post is that it forces people to engage in what we call strategic voting. Strategic voting means not voting your values. Effectively, our elections become this horse race between 2 dominant parties, and the bandwidth of choice and political discourse is narrowed. And we feel forced to vote strategically not for what we want, but against what we most fear or dislike. That's not real choice. See, if you're a free market-oriented person, but you're frustrated with the BC Liberals, right now, you have nowhere to go but to hold your nose or opt out. And similarly, if you're a lefty voter, but you're frustrated with the NDP, you have nowhere to go but to suck it up or sit it out. First Past the Post limits real competition. And that, incidentally, is why I think when you look at the no side, it's dominated by party apparatchiks who like First Past the Post because it allows them to maintain discipline and control and limit that choice, limit that competition. But our ideas and our values are more diverse than that. And our democracy is healthier when more views and ideas are in play. First Past the Post also results in the fundamental problem of wasted votes. And it operates in a couple of ways. First of all, most of us live in what we call safe ridings, where the outcome is a foregone conclusion. And so a lot of people feel like, why should I bother voting? You know, it's already known. It's kind of hard to blame them, frankly. But also, It functions this way. Listen to this statistic. In the last BC election, of the 1.9 million votes that were cast, 1.1 million of them, more than half, were cast for a candidate who lost, almost often in close elections. And once that happens, their vote disappears. It fails to find its desired political expression. That's what it means to have a winner-takes-all system like we have. But surely we are capable of being creative enough to imagine a system where that doesn't happen, where all of the votes find their desired political expression. And on a policy front, which is my bailiwick, First Past the Post also produces the problem of what we call policy lurch, meaning as power and false majorities swing back and forth between two parties, each new government spends a chunk of their first years essentially undoing the policies of the previous government, and so the pendulum goes. And if you want to know what I mean, look no further than the Ford government undoing the Wynne government's work, or Trump undoing Obama, or Trudeau undoing Harper. It's inefficient, and it's actually bad for business. I mean, imagine if you're like a green energy person in Ontario and you've invested millions of dollars in some new initiative, only to have the Ford government completely undo the policy context upon which your business case was based. In contrast, because the minority governments produced under pro-rep require compromise across parties, they are more likely to produce policies that have broad appeal and that stand the test of time. All told, this is a powerful piece of graffiti, I think. I would contend that First Past the Post is having a negative impact on our faith in democracy. And the disillusionment that results from what I've just described to you is part of this long-term decline in voter turnout. Canada ranks 26th out of 34 OECD countries when it comes to voter turnout. I think we can do better than this antiquated system. By the way, there's lots of sharing going on in this campaign. I ripped these slides off of BC Youth for PR. They're all done by this 16-year-old kid on Salt Spring. I like that one. So, how would switching to pro-rep fix what I've just walked you through? So first of all, what is pro-rep? Fundamentally, it's important to appreciate that proportional representation isn't a system, it's a principle. There are many forms, many models of proportional representation, but they all have in common this. Very simply, first of all, the popular vote is reflected in the distribution or makeup of the legislature and the seats. So if you get 30% of the vote, you have 30% of the seats, et cetera, et cetera. Secondly, they're stable because they actually avoid the problem of policy lurch. They make policies that are built to last, because they have that majority support, and they're successful. 9 out of 10 of the top economies in the OECD use proportional representation, and I say this because there's this fear-mongering on the no side, that the economy will go to hell in a handbasket. It's nonsense. The United States is the only country in that top 10 that uses First Past the Post. Proportional representation means no more false majorities that rule with impunity. It means no more false narratives about our values. It means we don't need to engage in strategic voting to keep out the party we most fear. No more wasted votes, no more policy lurches, more diversity of debate and ideas. Almost always, proportional representation produces minority governments. I think that's great. I like minority governments. And they force cooperation. Parties have to pull together governing alliances that in combination reflect the majority of voters. And if you want to know what that looks like, look no further than the government we have right now in BC and the confidence and supply agreement between the NDP and the Greens transparently lays out the basis of their agreement. You can download it from the web. A common argument against pro-rep is that it produces unstable governments that can't get anything done. It's simply not true. Some of our nation's most popular and long-lasting policies, old age security, the Canada Pension Plan, Medicare itself, they are all the product of minority federal governments. And look at this new BC government that we have under the confidence and supply agreement. people might have their beefs with one policy or another, but failure to be bold, I don't think, is a legitimate critique. We have the first major new social program of a generation in public childcare. We have the first progressive property tax system in North America. They're getting things done, clearly. But on a related point, those minority governments also produce more accountable government. I would contend, and arguably, I'm sure some New Democrats I know may disagree with what I'm about to say, but I actually think this outcome that we have means that the Greens are holding the NDP more accountable for their own promises than if the NDP had won an outright majority. But it goes deeper than that, and let me relate this to your next panel. See, if you only need 40% to win outright power, you don't need to concern yourself with the other 60. You're not accountable to the population as a whole. And when I look at the record of the last NDP government, and as you heard, my work at the CCPA is mostly in the realm of poverty reduction. And I think, why did this last government drag their heel? Why were they so resistant to the call for a poverty reduction plan for so long? Why were they content to leave welfare rates frozen for 10 years? And why did they drag their heels for so long on the housing affordability crisis? I think part of the answer, cynically, I'm afraid, is that they simply made a political calculation that the people most impacted weren't part of their 40%. But the point is, when every vote counts, every vote matters. On the policy front, what we actually know from the evidence is that by many measures, PR countries produce better policy and have more caring societies. And we know this from research that compares pro-rep countries versus what we call majoritarian systems like first past the post. Arndt Leipart, whose quote this is from, is really one of the global political science authorities in terms of comparative political systems, who's spent decades doing these comparisons. And he, along with others, keeps finding that PR countries have less inequality than majoritarian countries, and the results are highly statistically significant. We know that PR countries have stronger environmental policies. They were faster to adopt the Kyoto Protocol. Their share of global GHG emissions is going down. They score higher on the United Nations Index for Human Development, which captures health, education, and standard of living indicators. Overall, the empirical evidence across the OECD countries shows that PR outperforms winner-take-all systems on measures of democracy, quality of life, income inequality, diversity among elected representatives, values of tolerance, environmental performance, and fiscal and economic policy. On one of those points, what we clearly know from the comparative evidence is that pro-rep tends to produce legislatures that better reflect who we are. The gender balance is better, the representation of racialized people is better, the representation of indigenous people is better. And that's because any system that uses either party lists or multi-member ridings, and we're getting to that in a second, the parties would be strategically foolish not to present groups that represent that diversity. And so they don't. And the reflection is there. We also know from the evidence across the OECD countries that voter turnout is higher in PR countries. On average, 7 percentage points higher, and for young people, 12 percentage points higher. And I think it just stands to reason. All right, I'm going to switch gears now. That's my high-level argument for why we should change. I'm going to walk you through what's actually on the ballot. So first of all, in those mail ballots we're all going to get, the ballot itself will have 2 questions. The first question is pretty straightforward. It simply asks, which system should we use in our provincial election? Do we want to stay with first past the post, or do we want to switch to a system of proportional representation? Pretty clear. The second question, a little more complicated. It says, if a majority of people vote for change on question 1, which form of proportional representation should we choose? There's 3 options. Don't worry, I'm going to walk you through them. And it asks people to rank those 3 choices. Importantly, If you don't want to answer question 2, you don't have to answer question 2. Your ballot's not spoiled, so you don't have to answer it. And on the flip side, if you vote to keep first past the post in question 1, you can still weigh in and have an opinion on question 2. Why not? If this was about desserts, here's a slide from Fair Vote. It would look something like this. What kind of dessert do you want? Something from the old country like Spotted Dick sponge pudding, or something popular all over the world? And if we switch to something popular over the world, I'll rank your favorite choices. I don't think it's too complicated. All right. The 3 options. I'm going to walk you through the 3 options. All right. By the way, I'm going to walk you through these a little bit quickly. My feeling is if you really want to get a good handle on the 3 options, it's about half an hour of homework. I don't think that's asking too much. I don't think that's asking too much of British Columbian voters. We've handled complicated, I mean, we've had a referendum on the Charlottetown Accord, for God's sake. That's complicated. All right, the first system is dual member. The way dual member works is that neighboring pairs of ridings would be combined into a new riding, twice the size, but it would have 2 MLAs. Parties would nominate two candidates for each of those ridings, so a first-ranked and a second-ranked, and you vote for the team, not the individual candidates in this model. The first seat would go to the candidate of the party with the most votes in that riding, just like it works now. But the second seat would be allocated based on the overall popular vote. So for example, the way it would work is the first seats would be distributed just like they are now, and then the system would go, okay, in order to have a legislature that reflects the popular vote, the Liberal Party needs X more seats, the NDP needs Y more seats, the Green Party needs Z more seats, etc. And then it goes back and it looks at where the parties performed the strongest, and they get the second seat. And your ballot will look something like this. It's actually a pretty simple ballot, and it looks mostly like our current ballot, except for the fact that the parties tend to have 2 candidates instead of 1, although they don't have to. And you could have independents, of course. And in this model, if the independent in the riding comes in first or second, they get the seat. Mixed member. It's mixed because MLAs are elected in 2 ways. About 60%, at least 60% actually, of the MLAs are elected as they are now, under first past the post, but in somewhat larger ridings. So the ridings are about 2/3 larger than they are now. Or think about it this way, the ridings would become more or less the same size as they are federally. Okay? So I find that a helpful way of thinking about it. The other 40% of MLAs are elected from regional party lists, so that each party gets a total number of seats in the legislature that reflects the popular vote. But even here, so mixed member is used in Germany and it's used in New Zealand, but the Attorney General tweaked it a little bit for us, because in those other countries, the list MLAs are usually for the whole country. They're drawn for the whole country. But Dave Eby wanted to assure people that no region would have fewer MLAs than it currently does. And so he said, we're going to have, the list will be regional. So every MLA will be accountable still, if not still to a local riding, minimally to a region. And your ballot would look something like this. You actually have two questions on this ballot. Your first question is in your riding, and it works just like it does now. There's the list of candidates, choose your preferred candidate. But your second question would be for the regional party. And it remains to be determined. This is one area where the Attorney General said, if this is chosen, we'll figure it out after. The parties would present their lists. You may just vote for your preferred party, and then they would pull from the party list. Or you might get even more choice, and you'd be able to say, well, from party B, the person I really like is this person, and individually select your preferred one. And the third and final system is called rural-urban. And it actually combines 2 PR systems. Rural areas would vote using the mixed member system that I just showed you. But in urban and suburban areas, including Nanaimo, we would vote using STV, the single transferable vote, which is the same model that the Citizens Assembly on Electoral Reform recommended and that we voted on in 2005 and in 2009. So those urban ridings would be combined into larger ridings with 4 to 7 MLAs who are elected by ranking candidates in order of preference. That's why it's called preferential, or the single transferable vote, I should say. One of the things that I think is a strength of this model, like I voted yes to STV the last 2 referendums. I liked STV, but it did have a weakness, which is that it didn't work well for rural British Columbians because the ridings would become too large, right? Like if you combine 4 ridings in Vancouver, you know, it's no big deal really, it's 10 minutes on the bus. But if you combine 4 rural ridings, it's a big deal. And so this model, rural-urban, fixes that problem. It says most British Columbians will vote using STV, but in the large rural ridings, instead of having to become 4 times larger, they only have to become 2/3 larger, basically like they are federally. And your ballot in the urban ridings would look something like this. So let's say it's a riding that's electing 4 MLAs. The parties would have their slates of candidates, but this is the one that most empowers the individual voter because you get to rank as many or as few people as you want, and you get to mix it up, right? You might say, oh, I really like candidate B from party A, but my next favorite is candidate number 1 from party C. And independents can also run. In fact, this is the system where an independent is most likely to win, or would stand, I should say, that would stand the best chance of winning. And that's because if the ridings are electing 4 to 7 MLAs, each MLA would only need to win 15 to 25%. And so if an independent isn't aligned with the party, doesn't have the party machine, but they have a strong local base of support, they might actually stand a decent chance of winning one of those seats. Those are the 3 systems. Like I say, I think it's about half an hour of homework to delve into these. But I want to point out some things that are true for all 3 of the systems. Under all 3 of the options, I would say they are a huge improvement over what we have now. So I think people should go into, approach their ballots knowing that there's no wrong answer here. They all produce proportional outcomes reflecting how we actually vote. They all, I would argue, not only preserve, but in fact enhance local representation because you would not only have a nearby MLA accountable to you, you would also have a nearby MLA with whom you share some political affinity, instead of like being in the interior of BC and having to drive 2 days to find one. They all improve the diversity of the legislature. They all ensure no region will have fewer MLAs than we currently have. They're all innovative made-in-BC models that reflect our unique needs and geography. The Attorney General's criticized for not sort of just, taking something that exists somewhere else. Why would we criticize that? Why wouldn't we create something that works just for us? None of them would significantly increase the size of the legislature. The regulation caps that at 8 new seats. And for people who are still feeling, and they all have this minimum threshold of 5%. So that's about if a party is truly fringe and can't secure 5% of the vote, they don't get a seat. And if people are still feeling nervous, there's another helpful thing in the regulations from the Attorney General, which is that they have committed that there will be a second confirmation referendum after 2 elections. So we get to road test it. It's like an escape clause, right? Which is fabulous because so much of this debate is so theoretical, eh? Like, ultimately, we know what we know until we experience something different. And this means we actually get to try something out, and then we get to vote again, and if we don't like it, we can switch back. But no country that has ever done this has chosen to switch back. It's worth noting, because once they try it, turns out they like it. 85% of developed countries already use some form of PR, and yet we're told this is too complicated. I don't think we're stupider than these good people. But given that most democracies use PR, it's fairly easy for people on the no side to cherry pick examples of some country facing some challenge and try to pin it on the electoral system instead of any number of other factors. In particular, the no side is fear-mongering around that PR will elect, risks electing all these far-right extremists. As I showed you off the top, look at Trump and the alt-right. Look at Modi in India. No electoral system has a monopoly on either preventing or fostering right-wing parties. But I would say this: if those sentiments are there, it's good to know what we're dealing with. And if they don't find expression in their own political parties, they find expression in other ways. They live in the White House. They get dog whistled to in the big tent parties. More to the point, to the extent that we have a problem with the far right, let's actually deal with the policies and the economic policies and the inequality that's driving that. So a couple weeks ago, I was debating Suzanne Anton at the Surrey Board of Trade on this. She opened with the results from Sweden and the fact that Sweden had just seen an election where the far right got 17% of the vote. It's distressing. There is a rise of the far right. But Europe is dealing with the largest, and it's true that there's a racist, anti-immigrant sentiment in Sweden. Europe is dealing with the largest refugee crisis since the Second World War. And you know how we had that raging debate a couple years ago in Canada about whether or not we would take 25,000 Syrian refugees. Sweden, with a population less than a third Canada's, since 2015, has taken 300,000. I think we are poorly placed to be offering morality lessons about tolerance to them. The proof is in the pudding. So how do we win? First of all, people have to vote. We need to get the word out that this election is happening, and we have to get the vote out. We need to talk about this with our friends and our families and our coworkers. I would really encourage people to just send a personal email to your whole network telling people this referendum is happening. I'm going to vote yes. Here's why. Here's why I think this is important. A huge amount of the success, I think, will depend on many of our organizations animating their own base and all of us individually talking this up with our networks. Host a talk like this. I'm happy to share my PowerPoint with anyone. Write letters to the editor and call into the radio shows. There's so much great stuff on social media that it's being produced now that you can share. Donate to the Yes campaign. Volunteer or canvass with groups that are doing that. And if you want to do that, here are links to the main groups that are doing that. So the Vote PR is the main yes, the official yes proponent group. They're looking for volunteers. Lead Now is looking for volunteers, and Fair Vote's looking for volunteers. And conveniently, Fair Vote's got a table here in the lobby. They're doing fantastic work, and that's the web page for the CCPA. At the CCPA, we've created a single web page where we've amalgamated all of the work that we're producing on PR, and that's where you'll find it. In sum, ProRep incentivizes parties to make decisions together, gathering the input and expertise of one another to build long-lasting policies to urgent problems that cannot simply be undone for partisan purposes because they are designed with the majority in mind. We deserve a democracy where we get to vote for the representatives we want and not just against those we most fear. And we deserve to be liberated to vote our values and feel safe knowing that it will make a difference and that our votes will not be wasted. And under PR, that will be the new normal. And to those who worry that PR will enable the far right or produce too much uncertainty, I would simply say this: trust the values of British Columbians. Their values on the whole are good and progressive and caring. ProRep is going to be transformative. You can't just take the results of a past election and superimpose it on the new system. We don't know what it's going to look like. Is there some uncertainty about what it will look? Yes, there is some uncertainty. But I'm convinced that if we liberate British Columbians to vote their values, the outcome is going to serve us well. Thanks. So we got time for Q&A?
All right. Is this working? There we go. All right, we're going to do a Q&A session. So we're thinking of keeping the questions to about 1 minute and making sure that they are in the form of a question. Yeah, and we're going to run the mics. Myself and Jessica will be running the mics. So if you have a question, just put your hand up and then we'll come see you on alternating sides of the room. Jessica, do you want to start that one right there?
So one of the questions and concerns, rather, I'm hearing a lot from the no side is, well, half of our MLAs will be appointed, not elected. Now, you talked a little about regional lists, and the way it was described in your talk, it made it sound to me like these were party-designed regional lists. So are we committed to then a closed list system?
We're not.
Can we speak to open and closed lists
Yeah.
and how that might work differently?
Good question. So first of all, no one gets appointed. People still have to, everyone has to get elected. And I would point out that it's the case now that parties decide who the candidates are. And we get to vote for those candidates, but it's the parties that decide. Again, you know, when I was debating Suzanne Anton, and here's a little confession. So we know each other. She was actually at my wedding. She's best friends with my mother-in-law. So I know exactly where she lives. And so I said, look, I live in East Vancouver in one of the safest NDP ridings in the province. You live in Kerrisdale in one of the safest Liberal ridings in the province. And we all know how this goes. There's a pitched battle for the nomination where a handful of party members decide who the candidate will be, and then the seat's theirs. That's how the system works in a lot of ridings. What would happen with the change? So first of all, it depends which model, right? So dual member doesn't work that way, obviously. It's the parties have the two candidates. And the system that most maximizes and empowers the individual voter, I would say, is STV in the third model. Because the individual voters, so the parties have their lists of candidates, but it's the individual voter who gets to rank the individual candidates. I find that appealing. Your question relates in particular to the mixed member system, where 40% of the MLAs are elected from these regional party lists. So the parties would still all have to present their lists before the election, right? The voters know who's on the list. If you don't like the looks of the list, don't vote for that list. It is true, though, and this is my one critique of where the Attorney General went. In our submission to the Attorney General on the form of the referendum, we actually quite liked this dual question model. We recommended that. But we said, preemptively say that it's going to be an open list. So the parties will present their list, but the individual voter should get to choose how they want to rank those lists. So that's called open list, whereas in a closed list or party ranked list, the parties simply present their list in the order that they want, and if you vote, if they get seats from that list, it's just drawn in order. That's called closed list. The Attorney General simply said, we'll decide, if mixed member is chosen, we'll decide open or closed list afterwards. We'll put it to a parliamentary committee. I wish he hadn't done that. And if that's where we go, and I suspect by the sounds of your question, I'm going to campaign hard for open list. I like open list. And that would remain to be seen.
All right, was there any questions on this side of the room? Yeah, okay.
Hi there, my name is Pele Guda. I'm a political science student here. I'm also running for city council.
All right.
Now, I wonder, okay, so from a poli-sci perspective, I mean, there's really no doubt which is more democratic, which one is superior if the value that you're basing it on is democracy. it's proportional representation. But sometimes if you make things too plebiscitary, you open things up to propaganda and you open things up to fear-mongering, and you end up with the correct choice then being shot down. So why, given that, are we doing a second referendum after the test run when, like you said, no country or place has ever gone back, with the exception of, by the way, Italy, which did go back and then went back again?
Okay, thanks for that.
Just curious.
I think I really like this confirmation referendum. I think it's nice to be able to, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty out there, and I think it's nice to be able to say to people, first of all, you're being empowered to choose which of these things you most like, to rank them. There's no really wrong answers, but mostly you're going to get another kick at the can. Once you're going to get a chance to see it in practice. And I think that's good. I think that's good. You know, in terms of, will the system still be open to propaganda from different parties? I mean, look, different political parties say all manner of things now. But like I said in conclusion, I trust the values of British Columbians. And I think, in the end, what are we saying here? We're saying we believe in democracy and want to give people a choice. Again, you know, when I was debating Suzanne at the Board of Trade, you know, and people kept saying, oh, I'm worried about too many parties and it's going to be too chaotic and uncertain. And I said to them, like, I'm standing here in front of a business audience. They're a business audience. You purport to be all about believing that choice and competition makes for a healthier economy. By what logic do you think that's not true of our politics? Let's try it out.
Could you please put back the page that showed the rankings of the OECD countries?
Like the voter turnout rankings?
Yes, please. And will all this, I take it it'll be on the CCPA website.
It is.
And
on that page that I showed you there.
Perfect. And also the 85% of the democracies that are pro-rep, those are also on the website listed?
Yeah, like I said, I'm happy to share this slideshow with anyone, and there's videos of me presenting this slideshow on that site that I just showed you. Hi.
Okay, I'm just wondering how long it takes to find out who's won the election. I've worked for a few newspapers, and it's always election night, you know, you're getting the victory speeches and all the drama and stuff like that. And in a system like this, it's, you know, you'll probably end up like the last provincial election where you take weeks and weeks to find out who won. But how would the individuals, how long would it take?
Well, so there's two parts to it, right? One is the actual results on election night, and then there's the second question, which is that if it's a minority, how long would it take to kind of see what kind of governing alliance comes together? These days, so take something like the STV counting where you're ranking all of them. If you were manually counting, you can do it manually, but it would take a long time because first you're counting everyone's first choices and you're seeing who hits the threshold, and then you're dropping someone off and distributing their second choices. So manually it takes time, but these days it's computerized and it would be almost instantaneous. Just like municipal election. Do you use computers in your Nanaimo ones? Right, so it's the same. It's the same as like the at-large system there would happen fast. And I would point out that the at-large systems we use municipally are about double the size of the ridings that we're contemplating here. On the second part of that, you know, like, it might take a few weeks and the sky doesn't fall. Like, it helps now that at least we've had the experience of the last couple of years in BC, right? And we all remember the summer, you know, we had those 8 weeks when we didn't know who the government would, you know, it was all very entertaining and made for great drama, but, you know, the work of government continues. There were major forest fires. The outgoing ministers remained the ministers. They cooperated. The work of government got done, and then we figured it out, and onward we went.
Hi. My question is, if the maps of the new ridings that there'd be under the, is it all, do all three systems have different
They would all have different maps.
And do those maps already exist?
They don't. That's another area where the no side is like, oh, there aren't maps, and how can we be expected to vote? And they like to point out that, let me go back and offer a little history. So the 2005 referendum on STV actually achieved 58% support. Do you remember that? But Campbell had set the threshold at 60%. It had a double hurdle, actually. It had to win 60% of the popular vote in 60% of the ridings. It cleared the second hurdle, no problem. It passed in every riding but one, in Kamloops, I believe. But it got 58% instead of 60, and so it failed. And then we had the second referendum 4 years later. That one did have maps. And I do think that part of what happened was, particularly in rural British Columbia, they could see that the ridings were too big, which is why I quite like the rural-urban model, because it fixes that. So are there certain things that would have to be determined after the results of the referendum? And in particular, what would the boundaries be, and which ridings would be combined if it was dual member, and which ridings would be combined if it's STV, and so on? Yes. And that happens now too, right? Periodically, we redraw the maps, and we empower the Independent Electoral Boundaries Commission to do that work, and that's what we would have to do again. And again, back to your point, and if you don't like the looks of it, you get another kick of the can in the confirmation referendum.
Just a quick clarification for the, with the rural-urban. Do we know what is defined as urban? So I come from the Comox Valley, which is, the riding itself is an urban riding. It's all the city of Courtenay and Comox, but all of the neighboring ridings are fairly rural.
Right.
And how would that, do we know anything about how that would work?
So we don't know, we don't have the maps yet, but I think it would be logical to assume that it's really about geographic footprint. So I would imagine that any community that's large enough now to have more than one riding, including Nanaimo, would be considered urban and have STV. And it would only be those rural ridings that really have a large physical geographic footprint that would stay under MMP. No.
Anyway, I would like to know about the polling that's been done. And what your gut feeling is going into this. Now, it's pretty hard to work very hard. I want to sense that it's got a chance.
Well, the polling I have seen is that a majority of British Columbians want change. They want to switch. So I'm slightly cautiously optimistic, but I do think this is an uphill battle. We're going to all start getting a lot of information from Election BC, and that's good, but it's been slow coming. Ultimately, we'll all get material in our homes that list and explain the three options. The status quo always has an advantage. And the no side is really playing a fear card. And at one level, people fear change, and you kind of have this tendency to stick with the devil you know, rather than the devil you don't know. So I actually think, I wouldn't, if I were a betting man, I would not put money on this succeeding. It's going to hinge on all of us truly mobilizing. It's challenging because people are all distracted by the municipal elections. I know we are in Vancouver, and I know you are here in Nanaimo. And this comes after. One of the reasons why the Attorney General chose the mail ballot is because his advisors said the mail ballots tend to have higher turnout, participation rates than municipal elections, which they do. So that helps, I think. This is certainly by no means a slam dunk. We got to work hard.
mics are working. There we go. Okay. So we have time for 2 or 3 more questions, and there was one up here, so we'll go ahead and do that one.
Liberal voters on Vancouver Island tend to be underrepresented in the legislature. So there's a strong case for Liberal voters to support PR. My question is, how do we reach them and how do we convince them of the merits of PR when their own party is telling them to vote no?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. Show them the map. So it is, I think a lot of that hinges on that argument I was trying to make that when we think about local representation, geographic proximity matters and political affinity matters. So if you are a liberal-minded voter on Vancouver Island, you have a long trek to find somebody who shares your political affinity. Similarly, if you're in the interior, you have lots of nearby people, but you're frozen out of government. You're not in cabinet. Chances are you're not in cabinet. So this is a way to change that map so that everyone's represented in cabinet, regardless of where they are, and everyone has a nearby person. I keep coming back to these debates I'm having with Suzanne Anton, but she and I had this back and forth. We both had pieces on local representation in the Tyee a few weeks ago. I had one, and then she had one going after me. And she said, I was an MLA in Vancouver, Fraserview, and it didn't matter what my politics were. I was happy to meet, I would meet with anybody and try to represent them as best that I could. Well, listen, here's the thing. Like I went to meet my MP for the first time when I was 15 years old in Montreal to talk about disarmament and the cruise missile testing. And in the years since, I've been to see my MLA and MP many times. I never go to see them for partisan purposes, and I've never gone to see them to get some personal help with some service or another. I've only ever gone to see my MP or my MLA as a citizen to talk about an issue I cared about. And my question to Suzanne Anton would be, point to me an example of a time you voted against your party on a matter of significance because your constituents thought a certain way. And they can't. You need to find a nearby MLA with whom you share some political affinity.
All right, so there was one last question. Where was that? Right there? All right.
Okay, this harkens back to a point that you made earlier about narratives and then maybe a few comments ago. I'm wondering if there's an underlying narrative that we're not talking about that is driving the concern for chaos that we hear in the no voters. And that is that we seem to feel that, or we seem to relate to our politics in a competitive manner. I mean, we do compete when we elect the officials, but we seem to be relating as if the policymakers are competing as well when they should be cooperating.
I like that point. Yeah, well, this is what I was trying to get at when I say, so the system that we have now is what we call winner takes all. So you imagine a foot race where there's 6 competitors, and whoever gets over that line, they're the winner. Now, it's almost like thinking about democracy like a sports competition, where there can only be one winner. Except here's the great thing about a legislature with just shy of 90 seats. We're not restricted to one winner. We can have many winners, which is why we ought to be able to design a system that reflects the diversity of what we actually want.
But that's going to mean that we're going to need more skills around diplomacy and cooperation instead of cooperation.
And it is culturally transformative that way, I think. Recently, Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, was speaking in Vancouver about PR. And hearing her, I went to go hear her, and it was interesting because she was originally a kind of fierce partisan and an opponent of PR. And then the referendum passed in New Zealand, and she was Prime Minister under it, and she changed her opinion because, she said, of how she saw how it transformed their politics. And how it transformed the way people related and the kind of collaboration that it forced across party lines, and other transformative things too. Incidentally, I kind of skipped quickly over the question of Indigenous representation, but New Zealand is a fascinating case there as well. Long before the switch to PR, New Zealand has always had designated Maori seats for a long time. And if you're Maori, you have to declare which system you're going to vote under. Will you vote for a Maori seat, or will you vote in the general election? PR has been so successful in increasing Maori representation in the legislature that there's an active discussion among the Maori to ditch the designated seats because they actually can have more impact and representation under PR.
All right, so our last question for Seth.
Hi. I'm just wondering how the official opposition will operate in a proportional representation system.
Well, so first of all, you will almost, I think it looks something like now, like what we have in BC, right? So every once in a, most of the time, first past the post produces false majorities. But every once in a while, it produces minorities, like happened in BC, where you have on the one hand a governing alliance, and the Greens had to decide, do we want to be in a formal coalition and get some seats in cabinet, or do we want to have an alliance but maintain our independence where we can still disagree with the government? And they chose the latter. And we still have an official opposition. Why would that be any different? Right? But again, back to your point, something changes in the water too. Because if you are a party, you're always cognizant that after the next election, you may actually need the collaboration and cooperation of this other party. So maybe you'll temper how partisan you act.
Awesome. So if you can join me in thanking Seth Klein for his insightful talk. Thank you, and that's for you as well.
Thank you.
Great.
Oh, and I forgot to say, in the break, I brought along CCPA donor forms out there. I brought along a CCPA email sign-up sheet out there, and our newsletter, which has a bunch of articles on PR. And I also highly recommend the stuff from Fair Vote.
Yeah, I was just going to say that too. There's a lot of tables set up outside that have more information about this stuff and also about the upcoming municipal elections. So we're going to take a 15-minute break right now and then come back and then have our panel presentation. All right. That was awesome. Thank you. Thanks.